CIA created the Cartel of the Suns in the during the Reagan administration, alongside the DEA, in order to supposedly allow the DEA to monitor drug trafficking routes and identify major drug traffickers inside the United States by, in their words, letting the dope walk. So that meant going to Venezuela, tapping two of the main contacts from inside the Venezuelan National Guard, one of them named Ramon Guillen Davila. He was sort of the whistleblower on this. And this was before Chavez was elected president. This was under the old kind of punto fijo pro-US government. And they asked them to allow shipments of cocaine to pass through Venezuela in order to reach the United States. This is something the DEA and CIA were doing throughout Latin America. But this got exposed. 2 CIA officers were fired. Tim Weiner, who's now sort of the preeminent historian of the CIA, exposed this in 1990 at the New York Times. Then 3 years later, Mike Wallace did a special on it for 60 Minutes featuring General Guillen speaking on camera about how they shipped actually much more cocaine into the US than was previously thought, over 20 tons. So this actually had an effect on the drug market in the United States and on the population of the US. And then the Cartel of the Sun sort of slipped away and disappeared out of the public's attention. Venezuela had not been thought of as a major drug trafficking route, or it's certainly not a producer of cocaine like Colombia, and definitely not a place where fentanyl is produced or trafficked. It tends to, the ingredients, the base level ingredients come according to the official story from China, and they're trafficked through the US-Mexico border. But Hugo Chavez, when he was president of Venezuela, he had a discussion program every week, sometimes more than a week, called Allo Presidente, where he would just address the nation through fireside chats. And in, I think it was 2007, he mentioned in one of these broadcasts that he had learned of a Pentagon proposal to label Venezuela as a major narco trafficking entity in order to promote regime change. That didn't happen at the time, but it was prescient, because after the failure of the 2019 scheme to install Juan Guaido as president and the failure of the military coup that Guaido and his mentor Leopoldo Lopez staged in Caracas in April.
Can you before you, I don't want you to skim through this. I think a lot of people don't know what happened in 2019, the attempted uprising with barely 24 soldiers that defected, so it wasn't really an uprising. Can you break it down to the audience of the regime change attempt by the US in 2019?
Well, I'll quickly go back further. Chavez was elected in 1998. He was extremely popular. He was responding to conditions which I can address later, where close to 70% of the population was in poverty, and much of the population was disenfranchised. 4 years later, the same forces, including Maria Corina Machado, that are being weaponized by the US to do regime change in Venezuela, staged a military coup, removed Chavez briefly, took him out to an island. They signed something called the Carmona Decree, named after the person who was supposed to be the new president, who was just a Venezuelan business executive with no popular base, Pedro Carmona. And then the population marched on Miraflores Palace and basically surrounded the palace, demanding Chavez return, and he was brought back, and that was the end of that. And after that, there were a series of regime change attempts. La Salida was a major attempt, starting with Maria Corina Machado's party, Sumate, which was funded entirely by the United States government through the National Endowment for Democracy, to depose Hugo Chavez through a popular vote or referendum. That failed. There were riots.
What year was that?
That was 2000. Her attempt started in 2004 at the height of Chavez's popularity, and it never came to a vote. However, I mean, it's worth mentioning because it's always said Chavez was this dictator and Maduro was a dictator. Chavez held a referendum to grant him greater powers under the Constitution in, I believe, 2008, and that lost. So there were votes that went the opposition's way. But every time they tried to do something undemocratic, they staged these riots called guarimbas, inspired by La Salida throughout 2013 and 2014. They really damaged the Venezuelan economy. Hundreds of people were killed on both sides. That ultimately failed. Then the National Assembly, which was elected, dominated by the opposition, backed by the United States, started enacting a series of measures in order to bring about U.S. military intervention. They actually called for intervention, declaring Venezuela to be a humanitarian emergency after U.S. sanctions started coming in 2015. And they then began to make way for an alternative government. The figure who is previously unknown, who was sort of placed at the fore of the Venezuelan National Assembly in 2017, was Juan Guaido. And the US in 2019, in the first Trump administration, decided to recognize Juan Guaido as president of Venezuela, declaring that, Nicolas Maduro's administration was illegitimate because he had instituted a constituent assembly in place of the National Assembly. It gets very complicated. And it wasn't constitutionally valid. Guaido was unknown, unpopular in Venezuela. But the point of making him an alternative government was that it allowed the United States to begin seizing Venezuela's embassies around the world, to deepen the sanctions, and then to deploy a series of legal maneuvers to steal Venezuela's largest foreign asset, Citgo, which was worth over $80 billion, claiming that it was the alter ego of Venezuela's state oil company, PDVSA, which they had put under sanctions. And this is part of the economic strangulation of Venezuela, which was only possible by recognizing a figure like Guaido as president. It also led to protests. And then in February of 2019, the United States, through USAID, working with Juan Guaido, staged the first attempt at a kind of invasion of Venezuela, but they called it a humanitarian intervention, claiming that conditions in Venezuela were so bad they needed these USAID trucks to ram across the Colombian border and save them. The trucks had barely enough aid to support a small town for a couple days. I was in Venezuela at that time. There was no humanitarian emergency, although the sanctions were causing economic pain.